Good evening. Good evening. My name is Gerald Caden, and I'm a professor of urban planning and design and director of the Master in Urban Planning degree program here at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I am delighted to introduce Robert Hammond, co-founder with Joshua David of Friends of the High Line. But that title doesn't remotely capture the true measure of our guest. Thomas Carlyle, the 19th century Scottish historian and essayist, is perhaps best known for highlighting the crucial role of heroes, individual human beings, in the making of history. I don't have to endorse every aspect of Carlyle's thesis, and I don't, by the way, to nonetheless recognize a hero tonight and the indispensable role he and his colleague played and continue to play in making New York City, and indeed the world, a better, happier place in which to live. One of the salutary lessons of tonight's story, if I may be so bold as to say it aloud, is what I would call the original, situated ordinariness of Robert and Joshua. Please do not misunderstand me, and I know Robert doesn't. To be sure, they were very talented individuals, but neither he nor Joshua was a leader of the free or any other world. They were not captains of industry. They were not top officials in city government. They were not deep-pocketed philanthropists. And they were not even trained urban planners, urban designers, landscape architects, or architects. Instead, they were citizens of New York City, like so many others, except for the singular virtue of an extra eye that allowed them to imagine, to see something that so many others did not. They had the idea of creating something magical out of something too many others deemed an eyesore. As cited in Martin Filler's recent favorable review of the Hammond-David book, High Line, The Inside Story of New York City's Park in the Sky, published by Farrar, Straus Giroux, and I gather available for purchase. Not tonight. Joe Rose, chair of the New York City Planning Department during Mayor Giuliani's administration, declared that the elevated rail line was, quote, the Vietnam of old railroad structures, unquote, and that, quote, it must come down, unquote. I don't know what Joe would say today, and maybe I'll email him later tonight to ask. Certainly Amanda Burden, current chair of city planning and longtime champion of public space, thought differently and provided public action to assist the project as it moved from idea to reality. What these two gentlemen accomplished then first reminds us of the intense power of a good idea, and that all of us have agency with regard to ideas and creativity, if we can just sit back, take the time, and imagine. But a second equally important message of what they accomplished is that ideas are a terrible thing to waste. Put another way, ideas are necessary but not sufficient. I like to say, perhaps because I am a lawyer as well as an urban planner, to plan is human, to implement divine. By that nostrum, Robert is truly divine. He and Joshua took their idea and slogged through years of political, legal, and financial machinations that would truly drive almost anyone to drink. And I'm not even certain that they weren't, in fact, driven to drink. They understood that creativity is not solely necessary to come up with an idea, but that creativity must inform every step of an implementation strategy. And their strategy was indeed creative. Who could have thought that there could be such buzz about an elevated abandoned rail line? Years ago, I had a brief encounter at 30,000 feet with the subject matter of their work. I co-authored an amicus curiae brief in a United States Supreme Court case in which property owners attacked the very constitutionality of the federal law authorizing so-called rails-to-trails transformations, the sort of transformation that Robert will tell us about tonight. It was the Perceau case. And I'm glad to report that Justice Brennan and his colleagues declined the invitation to render this nationally authorized idea beyond the bounds of government authority. But even as rails-to-trails transformations have flourished in communities nationwide, there is a first among equals, a transformative project that demonstrates that outdoor second floors aren't always a problem. I hope we don't end up with a High Line in every city in the world, but I'm thrilled that there is the one and only High Line in New York City, and that other cities worldwide are indeed looking and thinking anew and creatively about their existing infrastructures. Robert Hammond co-founded Friends of the High Line in 1999 with Joshua David. Before that, he was a freelance magazine writer and editor with work appearing in Gourmet, Fortune, Travel and Leisure, and Wallpaper, among other publications. He served as a member of Community Board Number 4 in Manhattan from 2000 to 2006. He received the Rome Prize from the American Academy in Rome in 2009. In 2010, he and colleague David were awarded the Jane Jacobs Medal in honor of their High Line work. Part inventor, part engineer, part conductor, part Coleman, Robert can say all aboard and mean it, and so I'm delighted to welcome Robert Hammond to the Harvard Graduate School of Design.
So thank you for that very nice introduction. One of the reasons that Josh and I wanted to write this book was that in a lot of the articles or introductions, it made us sound so smart and so talented that we were able to pull this off, when the reality, and when we started writing the book, we paused halfway through and it said, oh, it realized when you put it all out there, we sort of look like blundering idiots. And we really just were good at taking smart advice. And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to put that out there. And I'll tell you a little bit about that tonight and the process and all the people sort of that helped make that possible. But thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be here. First, I'm just going to go over a little bit of the history of the High Line, and then talk about how we sort of took this crazy dream into reality, and then go through a quick slideshow of just what it looks like today, and then sort of the future of the High Line. So the High Line is it runs 1.5 miles in Manhattan. It's on the west side. And it was an old train track. Originally, the trains used to run down 10th Avenue, and it was called Death Avenue because so many people were run over by the trains, and you can sort of get a picture of what that was like, that the railroad hired a guy on horseback to run in front of the trains, and he was called the West Side Cowboy. And this picture was taken right after the High Line was built in 1934. So this was taken at 18th Street and 10th Avenue. But still about one person a month was run over. So they built, it was part of a Robert Moses project called the West Side Improvement Project. It stretched originally all the way, the rail line stretched from Houston Street all the way to Spuyten Duyvil. They buried the High Line to the north of 34th Street. That's created Riverside Park on top of it. And then to the south, they elevated it, partly because it was on landfill, but also because it's to serve the different warehouses along the way. And it was always a freight line. It was never a subway or an L. And I love this photo because you can still see the trains running down on 10th Avenue. That's where that picture of the cowboy was taken. And this is what the neighborhood looked like exactly when we started this. In some ways, the High Line and in Joe Rose's defense, the High Line stopped development in a lot of ways in the neighborhood. But just in case some of you are familiar with the neighborhood, this is the kitchen. Anybody go to the Roxy? Maybe all too young for the Roxy. Okay, we got a few that went to the Roxy. It was an old dance club right there. That's London Terrace, the post office building there. But it was designed to service all the warehouses along the west side of Manhattan. This is actually the old Bell Labs building where the first commercial light bulb was developed, and it ran through there. That was an old refrigerated warehouse. And then the last train road, it was still used until 1980. Parts of it were demolished, but the last train was a trainload of frozen turkeys at Thanksgiving, or that's what someone told us, so now we say it, in 1980. And then it was unused. And this is what I first saw when I went up there. But what I really fell in love with first was from the street, this sort of steel structure. And I live in the West Village, and I just sort of seen parts of it. But then I read an article in 1999 in the New York Times that said it was going to be demolished. And Mayor Giuliani wanted to tear it down, the developers wanted it down, the community wanted it down. And I assumed someone would be working to preserve it, because that's what, I'm sure Boston's even worse. But in New York, everything has the preservation group attached to it. And so I thought I could volunteer. At the time I was working doing at a .com startup, and it was the first time in my life I had my own office, so I could close the door and so hence not do work. So I thought I could do this. And but I called around, no one was doing anything. And I heard it was on the agenda of a community board meeting. Had never been to a community board meeting, never wanted to go. Still don't like go. I've been to 100 probably. It's still not a big fan of actually. I love them, but I don't like going personally. It was on the agenda, so I went, and I sat next to another guy who I didn't know, who was a travel writer who lived in Chelsea, Joshua, and we didn't know each other. And at the end of the meeting, we realized we were the only two people interested in the project. Everyone else was either didn't care or actually really wanted to tear the thing down. So he said, "Why don't you start something?" And I'm really busy, and I said, "Well, I'm busier. You start it, and I'll help." We sort of, it wasn't a great meeting of like kindred spirits, really. But we exchanged business cards and followed up and said, "Well, why don't we start something together?" And our first goal was just to try to get someone else to take it on, the Municipal Art Society, the AA, Van Allen, someone to take it on, because he and I had no experience or background in any of this, and we both had our own careers. But we got the railroad. A lot of people also think we just snuck up, which would have also been more romantic, but we were sort of lame. We just called up the railroad and asked for a tour, and they said yes. So they first took us up there, and this is what we saw. And it was 1.5 miles of wildflowers. It was in the fall of '99, and it was this, and that's when I really fell for it, because it was this combination of this steel industrial relic that nature had taken over, and but with views of the Empire State Building around it. That's Josh and I later. That's what I sort of had fallen in love with. That's what you see from the street. And so when we started it, we definitely didn't have a plan. We definitely didn't have any money, and we had no relevant experience. And in some ways, that has been in a lot of ways the key to the success of that. I think if we had had a concrete plan, I think if we had had relevant experience, if we had been architects, that's the one thing that would have definitely doomed it. Not because architects, I love architects, because y'all work so hard for so little money, partly. But, or for free, or not even money. You don't even have to pay architects sometimes. But really, because then it would have been, we didn't have a vision for it. I mean, I should have put no vision. People assume, oh, you must have had this like laser-like vision of what you wanted. We didn't really know. We just thought, and Josh and I disagreed of what should be up there. We just knew, it shouldn't be demolished. Let's think about what different ideas. And I'll get to a little bit why that was so important. So we started Friends of the Highland. Well, I'll get to that. I guess I got to talk on this. Another thing we had going for us in some ways, I didn't realize it until afterwards, was the opposition. And that's what was so daunting. I mean, is that Mayor Giuliani was hell-bent on tearing this thing down. And if we couldn't convince anybody on the merits of it, and you'd explain, oh, it's an elevated rail line, you can do something with it, and they would look at you strangely, you could always say, well, Mayor Giuliani thinks it's a really bad idea. And they go, oh, well, then it must be a great idea. I'm happy to help. But, so we started the Friends of the High Line, and the goal was never just preservation. It was always reuse. And I think that's what's so important in what gave the project a lot of energy. It wasn't just about throwing ourselves in front of bulldozers. That was part of it. but it was equally about or more importantly, what's going to be about next. What's the next step? So one of the first things we did was get a logo. And this is designed by Paula Scher, who's at Pentagram. And I was actually working for this watch company designing a website. And so I was going around and interviewing designers. And so after that, she gave us a pitch to hire her. And I went up to her and I said, oh, I have this nonprofit, and we want to, will you do something for free? And so she even says she did the logo in hopes of getting the Watch World business. But subsequently has done all of our graphic design, and now this is the logo for the park, and she's done all the design that's you see up on the park now. But there's two parts about this that I think is important. One is that it gave us a feeling that we were more than we were. We were just two guys working out of our home offices. But it was also a commitment to design. Is that if we knew this was such, I was saying earlier that I'm definitely a dreamer, but also a realist. So I knew the chances of this actually happening were very small, 1 in 100. And but if we did succeed, I knew we didn't want to just like throw up a stairwell and a planter and call it a day. That we wanted it to be really amazing. That design would follow all the way through. So we put a lot of time and effort into design at every step. Invites, business cards, brochures. And in some ways, one, it was a way to get people more interested in it, because people just like good design. But it was also a commitment that design was going to be a part of this all the way through. One of the most important steps we did was we needed to, we fell in love with this picture. This is the same picture that I showed earlier. But people couldn't go up there. So we needed a shot, capture what it looked like up there. So we went to this photographer named Joel Sternfeld, and he spent a year capturing of what it looked like in all different seasons. And we published a book with him called Walking the High Line. It was just republished recently. And this is what people fell in love with. And I think Josh and I think of him as like a third co-founder, because especially this image became the defining image of the High Line. That's what we used over and over. And he let us totally bastardize, put text on it, do all different things that most artists would never let you do. But this was the best, this was the best sales piece again. And people could see different things into it. And then going back to the point about the architecture, I think if we had maybe been architects, we would start designing right away. And instead, we had some architects do some renderings early on, and they just didn't look that good. And then you realized that when you show this, people can imagine whatever they want. And so whenever people are starting organizations, I always urge them not to get too specific too early, because then people would say, well, I don't want that, or I'd do it differently. Whereas when they saw this, some people would say, well, that's just cool, you should leave it as is. Some people saw, oh, it's a site for architecture. Some people said, oh, it's a landscape site. Some people said, oh, I'm a rail buff, I love that they're tracks. And it sort of creates sort of this big tent. I love that photo. The other thing that we did was started to give interestingly, the community was not supportive of this early on. So the city wanted to tear it down, the developers wanted to tear it down, and the community wanted to tear it down. The community, interestingly, to me, how romantic a train ran through your neighborhood. To them, the people that used to live there, you didn't live on the wrong side of the tracks, you lived under the tracks. It was a reminder that they lived in a crappy neighborhood, and that it sort of stopped a lot of the changes in their neighborhood. And they just thought, they saw Josh and I, and they realized these guys are never going to do this. This is just not going to happen. So even if it might be a good idea, you're postponing the inevitable, let's just get it over with and get it down. But there were some people in the community that were interested in it. This is a photography project we did where we took people's picture in front of Joel's picture and put them all online and asked people what their dreams were. A lot of another key to the success was events. A lot of people, when they're starting nonprofits, think raising money is the worst part and just sort of the part that has to be done. But it's a great organizational building tool because it forces you to create a database. And it's a great way of getting, when you don't have any press, the other thing that press was another key. And press, when you don't have any progress, it's hard for them to write a story around. And so a lot of the stories, and there's been a lot of stories written on the Highline, were written around sort of events that we would do. In addition to raising money, that's actually Amanda Burden, who talked about it earlier. And these are just some of the early different events. And what we did with the money, interestingly, it was unfortunately it was fortunately it was hire lawyers. That was the other key to success. I used to think developers were so smart that they could get all these projects through that no one wanted. And I subsequently learned that they're not that smart, but they hire really smart lawyers to get things done. And we had lawyers that were willing to do pro bono, but we needed lawyers to sue that knew rail law, that knew the city charter law. And the people these lawyers, their clients are the railroads or the city. And so we had to hire lawyers to do this. And again, it was another really key piece that Josh and I could have never done on our own. But we hired some of the best lawyers in New York City. And it's amazing. You can stop anything with lawyers. We would never tell the people that's what we were doing with their money because no one likes to give money to pay lawyers. But that is what we were doing. The other thing is I used to think that all civic groups were really run or, you had to have rich women from the Upper East Side. Herbert Muschamp, the old architecture critic, said that, the story of preservation is gay men and straight women, I think, or straight rich women. And I really didn't, I just paid attention to the straight rich women. And so we spent a lot of time trying to get them interested. They weren't interested. And, we realized afterwards that the constituency we had was really, Josh and I are both gay, was just, at the beginning, it was a lot of gay men. And people would say, wow, there are a lot of men at this party. But, and this is a picture of Florent, who had the restaurant Florent, and this is, he dressed up for Bastille Day as Marie Antoinette every Bastille Day, and this one he did the High Line with the trains going around it. But it was creating the constituency that we had. These are the people that we knew, and it was the people in the neighborhood, a lot of small business owners that were attracted to the neighborhood because of low rent, a lot of architects, a lot of designers, a lot of the art dealers that were in the neighborhood. So Mayor Giuliani signed a demolition order right when he left, 2 days before he left office. We sued the city, but then Mayor Bloomberg came in office, and he was very supportive. And another good trick is always ask people for things when they're running for office, because it's very easy for them to say yes. We got all 5 mayoral candidates to say they support the High Line. But then Mayor Bloomberg came in office and he said, 9/11, economic disaster, sort of all bets are off. I don't care about the Joel Sternfeld photos. We're in an economic crisis. This needs to make economic sense. So we said, well, what if we could prove that over a 20-year time period, the benefits to the city and direct tax revenues would be greater than the costs, even though the city's not going to pay for it. And then, he said that, well, that would make it more interesting. So we commissioned an economic feasibility study, a guy, John Alschuler, who had done the city's Olympics economic feasibility study. And so he looked at, so Central Park's the best example of creating value from parks, but, it's big and the High Line's small. So we looked at these tiny little parks, and property around there has an increase in value of about 6 to 13%. And we met with the Sunshine Group and real estate marketers. And they said the number one way you're going to create value for real estate is to create a district. Apartments that are near Gramercy Park sell more, if you can say you're a Gramercy Park apartment. And we'd already sort of started creating sort of a buzz around the High Line. And, but that's when we realized we needed to really create and think about it as a High Line neighborhood. And this is a map, actually, that Paul Asher painted of all the businesses in the neighborhood. And it was trying to get people to think about all the different things that happen around there. Now there's a lot going on there, but then it was still sort of in an amorphous neighborhood. So the study, we actually got the study wrong. We thought it would cost $100 million to build. It cost $150 million to build. But the good news is we thought it would generate $250 million in new tax revenues for the city over 20 years. When the city updated that study a few years ago, and it came into almost $1 billion estimated in tax revenues. It's already created $2 billion in new construction in and around the High Line. So the city really got on board. Amanda Burden became the planning chair. Another big advocate, Dan Doctoroff, who was the deputy mayor of economic development, got on board. But we still didn't have any money. We didn't have the right to build. The property owners were still suing the city after the city changed. No one knew what the High Line was, even people in the neighborhood. So we decided we needed to create awareness. We needed to create some kind of momentum. So we did an ideas competition. And the idea was that the concepts didn't have to be doable. It just had to be, you could come up with whatever you want. And this was in 2003. This was one of my favorite, which was the mile-long lap pool, that would run through the city. I still think it would be amazing. We got 720 entries from around the world. It was the largest design competition up until the World Trade Center. And half the entries were international. And this is where people sort of started finding out about it. When we first started this, I felt like the only people that cared about the High Line were Dutch, Germans, Italians, and Japanese. We had tons of articles in Italy right when we started, and no one cared in New York. But the last one was from Russia. This is a political statement, also a pool, but you also fit in a prison in the middle. This is playing on high, I think. This is interesting because this is taking not a design standpoint, but what program would happen in and around the High Line. And I'll get back to that at the end of talking about the programs that are happening now. This is one of our other favorites, and the designer's actually in the audience. It was a roller coaster, and the idea is you could leave the High Line existing and then have this urban roller coaster, which is still a genius idea. You could see into people's apartments, zoom down. And we had the exhibition at Grand Central. And the idea was to make it not just a local project. We wanted this to feel like it was of citywide importance. And Grand Central, I found out, was named after the Central Railroad, which actually built the High Line. So there's the connection. So we'd always said that Josh and I weren't going to decide what it was going to look like, that the community decide. So after we had this competition, before we owned the High Line, before we were really designing it, we also didn't want to freak the community out that we were actually going to build a pool prison. And so we did, this was an invitation to a community input session that we did. And we've subsequently had, I should find out how many we actually had. It was over a dozen different community sessions where we got people's input at each stage of the design process and even before we really started designing. I think it's one of the mistakes. Most people go to the community after they have a design and they don't really want the input, because you don't really want to start over. And so, and the other thing is we found that you don't have to take all the advice. You just have to explain why you're not taking the advice and what you are doing. It's to have that dialogue and to be having it before you're finished designing. So we had to fight City Hall, but you can only get so far fighting City Hall, I guess. And this really is an example of a public-private partnership. The city definitely wouldn't have done it without us, but we couldn't have also done it without the city. And this is a lot of our supporters, Hillary Clinton and Chuck Schumer, Jerry Nadler got us federal transportation money for the project, Mayor Bloomberg, Christine Quinn. And I love this picture because they're all managing not to look at each other. If you notice, it's like they teach that. They don't, I guess, have to speak to each other when they're near each other. So the city got on board, But we still were fighting with the property owners because the property owners owned property underneath it, and the railroad just owned this easement through the air. So we looked at other examples where this happened, going back to Grand Central. Grand Central, most people assume, there's the famous campaign with Jackie O where she saved it. But the real mechanism they used to save it, I mean, that's what got the city to save it. But how they did it was a transfer of development rights, where they allowed, normally in New York, you can only sell development rights to your neighbor. And if your neighbor doesn't want them or doesn't need them, then you're out of luck. What they did is they allowed a transfer of development rights, so you can sell development rights anywhere in a certain area. So it really creates a market for your air rights, makes them more valuable. So it saved Grand Central, saved the theaters. Actually, Joe Rose did that rezoning, I think. Saved the theaters in Times Square in the 90s. And that was the mechanism that we had proposed with city planning, and Amanda Burden and the Bloomberg administration passed. So basically it allowed the property owners to sell their development rights anywhere in the neighborhood. But it did lead to, to more development in certain areas. So to counter just having tall buildings all along the High Line, there was a special rezoning district that created areas that have lower buildings next to the historic district, sort of in the middle of the High Line, with higher density at the northern and southern end. So that got the property owners on board and paved the way for us to be able to actually start thinking about really doing it. So the dilemma was, how this is what it was like. It was this magical environment, but how do you let people up there? We knew we had to rip everything out to put in new waterproofing and drainage and remediation, the lead paint remediation. So what do you do new? So we decided to do a design competition, and we had 4 finalists. Zaha Hadid, and she won the Pritzker Prize right as this was happening. And in the interview process, I asked, and that's not grass, that's AstroTurf. So I asked, do you not like trees? Because there's no trees on the High Line. And she said that trees are things architects put when they don't know what to do with the space. And I think she's a great architect, but we realized at that point that she was not right for us. This was a team by Michael Van Valkenburg and Julie Bargman. Had a lot of great ideas, really focused on keeping the landscape as it was. Stephen Hall, who was actually the first person that ever looked at the High Line, his Bridge of Houses project was the first, I think his first really what made him famous back in 1980. And he was the first person that really thought about different uses for the High Line. And he came up with a more sort of architectural approach, thinking about what you could do underside. And then there was a team of James Corner Field Operations and Dillers, Cofidio, and Renfro, which was the team we actually selected. And this was from their original board. And what's so interesting about this is basically what we've built. And the idea was this planking system that could be used in different ways, harder and softer, and it sort of combs into the landscape. But this isn't really why we picked them. I mean, or the reason why I wanted to pick them. It turns out to have been a good reason. It's because, but what I loved is in the interview, they started arguing amongst themselves. Because they were struggling with how do you keep sort of what made it special, but at the same time creating something new. And so I felt like that they understood this dilemma that we were feeling ourselves. And what's so great about this is, like I'll show you the flyover. I mean, they've really been able to realize, in section 3, I'm hoping to realize that one, but in the different sections, realize each one of these concepts. Here you can actually see, so we started construction, I think, in 2006. There you can see the planking. We had to take all the rails, put them back in. That's before the dirt went in. That's the pathways. I got some stuff out of order, but I'll go back. The planting, they also partnered with a guy named Piet Oeldhoff, who was a Dutch horticulturalist, that came up with this palette of plants that was reminiscent of what was growing up on the High Line. But I recently asked him, I said, should I be calling your landscape a natural landscape? And he said, there is nothing natural about it. It's idealized nature. And it's definitely true maintaining. It's very difficult to maintain. It's sort of like, I think of it like as a minimalist room. It's always hard to build minimalist rooms and very hard to keep them clean and neat. It's sort of the same with the High Line. But it changes all the time. And so every 2 weeks, there's different plants. It's all perennials. In that way, and about, I think, 20 or 30% of the species were already growing up there. The lighting was done by a guy named Hervé Descote. And the concept was, he's famous for designing hotels and like sexy bars and restaurants. And he didn't want any overhead light because, one, it's unflattering. But two, it just lights you and the pathway, and your eyes adjust to the light, and you can't see the city around. So the idea was to recess all the lighting in the railing, and it would light the planting in the path, and your eyes stay adjusted so you can see the city around you. And that's where you can see how these LED strips were slipped into the railing. And it's my favorite time up there by far, is at night. Because also the planting, in different seasons, you see the different shadows that the plants make. I like showing this because I know usually the renderings don't look like the real thing. And in this case, I think they really do. This is right after we opened. It's actually the trees are much lusher. Now that's at Gansevoort Street. That's where the High Line was cut off. It used to go all the way down to Houston, but it was demolished here. So there you can see, this is before we opened. You'll see how it's much thicker, but you can see how the planks sort of comb into the landscape. It's an aerial view. The structure was so overbuilt that we could remove I-beams to create the stairs that actually go up through the middle of the beams. There's another stair cutting through. This is a water feature that I got a great compliment the other day. Someone said, "Did you mean for that to happen, or is that just a leak?" Because it's just water that just comes up and creates this skim. And then in the winter, you turn it off, and it doesn't look like anything's missing. You can just walk on it. This is the sun deck. And I think the two favorite activities on the High Line is people watching and photographing other people. And you just kind of can see what all the different activities that happen up there. This is where the High Line runs through the old what was the Nabisco factory, which is now Chelsea Market. There's from the other side. This is the concept here is this is this square that went over 10th Avenue, and the idea was to cut out the steel and create an amphitheater. So we removed these steel beams to have this amphitheater. They reinforced it to hold up the structure there to create this theater over 10th Avenue. So it gives you this really unique view, over an avenue, which you usually don't get in the city. There's the view at night. And then pathway. This is now into section 2, so we opened section 1 in 2009, and we just opened the second section this summer. And what the designers did is they created almost these series of rooms. And you go through a series. And when I first saw it, I was sort of disappointed. I sort of wanted, in the design, like long fields of wildflowers, more what was growing up there. But by creating more variety, it changes the experience that you walk through. And so here's a lawn that we put in at 23rd Street. It's now the busiest lawn per square foot in New York. And we have to close it now about 3 days a week to let it breathe. It sort of peels up a little bit. This is called the flyover, and this was that concept I showed where they have something where you leave the surface of the High Line and go on yet another elevated walkway through a forest of trees, and these will grow to about 3 times that height. So you go in a few years, you'll be walking through a canopy of trees. So that's the elevated walkway about 8 feet above the surface of the High Line on metal grating. There you can see it again. The High Line used to be covered in billboards, so designers took a little play on that, and instead of advertising, it frames people. And the best view is really from the city, and you see people up there, and it lights up at night. This is the section in Upper Chelsea in the 20s. And this is looking south from 30th Street. And one of the great things about the High Line is it's encouraged a lot of the developers in and around it to use good architects themselves. So there's a spot where you can stand right here and see a building by Frank Gehry, Jean Nouvel. This is by Shigeru Ban. The better side's the other side. Annabelle Seldorf. That is now done by Neil Denari. And so it's become this sort of architecture row, but yet it still runs through 3 historic districts. So you get the old and new. And I love this billboard went away, but that's a great picture there. I just noticed that. It's also created a lot of development, as I talked about the construction. There's currently about 40 different development sites in and around the High Line. And the High Line real estate recovered much quicker than other real estate in New York. Normally, the farther you are from the subway, the slower it is to recover. This has been a reverse. So the closer you are to the High Line, the quicker the properties bounced back and have already restarted construction. It's also, this is, the Whitney is going to move to the base of the High Line. They're selling or renting the Breuer building to the Met. And this is a new building by Renzo Piano that they just started construction on. And that's actually, he's designed our headquarters. That's going to be our maintenance facility and offices right down there, the little black building. That'll open in 2013, and the Whitney will open in 2015. So the High Line's not done. We still have the last third to go. So these are the 2 sections. Right now, it currently ends at 30th Street, but it loops all the way around. That's the Javits Center. This is where the new number 7 is going to go, the first new subway in, I think, 50, 70 years in Manhattan. That's going to open in 2014. And so we have this last section to build. I'm not going to go in. There was a lot. Originally, when they looked at developing that, they wanted to tear the High Line down again because to develop this site. It's going to be the home of 12 million square feet of development. So it's downtown Seattle times 2. And this site will be the densest area of Manhattan. And there's an aerial view. And it's where a lot of those Joel Sternfeld pictures, those iconic pictures were taken. You have great views of the water. So the Jet Stadium and the Olympic Stadium was originally slated to go right there. Giuliani at one time wanted to bring the Yankee Stadium there as well. That was defeated, and so they rezoned it for commercial, residential, and retail. This is what's going to be there. The related companies have won that and just announced last week that they're starting construction next spring on the first building at headquarters for Coach, the leather goods manufacturer. And you can actually go on their website and see these are a little bit outdated. They just put new images, but you can see this is going to be a 1.2 million square foot building. These buildings, when they're all built, just those 2 will be larger than Rock Center. So it's going to be a significant, right now it's in the middle of nowhere. In some ways, this is going to be the new Midtown. So we're still working. We just last week announced that now all the parties have agreed to keep all of the High Line. There were still some parties that wanted to tear down what we call the spur, which is this piece of the High Line that goes over 10th Avenue. But now all parties have agreed to keep it. And we're going to be starting design of it. We're going to have our first community input session for this in December 6th, I think. We talked about starting the Friends of the High Line, Josh and I. We sort of morphed into a conservancy. And now we're not really a typical Friends group in that we manage and operate the park for the city. So it's a little different, but it's a common model in New York. The first example is Central Park. The Central Park Conservancy manages and operates Central Park. 80% of the funding for Central Park is private. All of the money for the High Line is private. All the gardeners, all the maintenance workers are all paid by private donations and members. And please become a member if you want. It starts at $40. So that was a model that we followed. And so when you see the employees, oh, there's a gardener wearing one of those T-shirts with our logo. All of that is paid for privately in all different weather. One of the difficult parts we realized sort of after we had designed it is you can't use salt because the water is recycled into the planting. So all the snow has to be removed by hand or these brushers. So when we first opened, we thought we would have about 300,000 people a year. That's what we were projecting. Now we get that in about 2 weeks. Just last weekend in November, we had 65,000 people. This year, we're set to have 3 million people. And so I highly advise. It feels like all of them come on Saturday and Sunday between 1 and 5. So if you want to visit the High Line, come during the week. And I highly recommend at night. I think it's the best time up there. So I'm from San Antonio, and a lot of people say, oh, do you want it to be like the Riverwalk? And I have always said, no. And the Riverwalk's very nice, but I never went to the Riverwalk. It's just really for tourists. It's an excuse for different concessions and convention business. And so that's one of my biggest fears now that the High Line is obviously successful is sort of over-success. Does it become just for tourists? And to me, the High Line will only be successful if we want it to be good for tourists and visitors, but that it really feel owned by New Yorkers. So we do a whole series of programs that are really designed for locals. We focus a lot on kids. This is a step festival that we did, a music piece. We have this work yard kit. And my favorite programs are also just the unintended ones. All of a sudden, these astronomers would come up and bring their telescopes, not to look for themselves, but to let other people look. I was up there the other day, and they said, and they didn't know who I was, and I was just walking by, and they said, do you want to see Saturn? And, I didn't know you could see any stars in New York, but they showed me Saturn. And this is also, I don't know if this is a good side, but the other activity, it's famous it's more of an urban myth, but for watching people have sex in the Standard. And you just see tourists just stand there, like looking up for a long time. I look all the time, and it rarely happens, actually. So the other thing we do is an art program. With the exception of this piece, all the other art we do is temporary. This is a piece designed by Spencer Finch, and it's 720 panes of glass taken from a study of the Hudson River. He took a picture of the Hudson River every minute for 720 minutes. It's called The River That Flows the Both Ways. This is a Sarah Z sculpture to incorporate bird habitat and feeding. Someone asked me if it was a comment on, are you creating designer homes for birds that then you will take away? I said, no, but I like that. This is a Robert Evans. Is it Robert Evans? Does anybody know? Photograph, I think it is, Robert Evans. That Joel Sternfeld selected in a series where we're doing things on that billboard. Another thing about the High Line, the most commonly asked question besides where can we buy your staff T-shirt is where can I get something to eat? And so it's one of the things that we're looking to expand is food options. And we've never had any crime on the High Line, but we do get people ticketed for drinking alcohol. So we opened a little beer and wine bar here, and it's also a way to earn revenue. We're looking at opening a full-scale restaurant underneath the High Line and looking to break ground on this in January. And this would be tucked under the entrance at Gansevoort. And I just want to, this is what I want to end on. Why I feel like what I love about the High Line is just how people have taken ownership and use it in different ways, like the astronomy group, which is now a regular part of our programs. But when we first opened section 1, we had misdirected one of the lights on the stairs, and it accidentally shined into Patty Helferty's bedroom window. And she called us, and we were so busy that we didn't respond back. She called again and complained, and then, like any good New Yorker, she turned it into her own advantage, and she got a friend, a cabaret singer, to start serenading people on the High Line. And it became a thing. And she would put out these Chinese lanterns, and that was a signal that that night there would be a cabaret performance. She had one of her, and then the landlord cracked down, and one of her final ones was a burlesque performance. So, you know, that it sort of keeps evolving in ways that we didn't intend. And I have to make a plug for the book. I hope if you're interested, you know, it's really the story from 2009 to 99. I mean, what is it? 99 to 2009 of this process with a lot of photos. It benefits Friends of the Highline. The other thing I'd encourage, if you're interested, you know, become a friend on Facebook or sign up for our email newsletter. We put out all of the different talks if you're ever in New York and all the different programs. And I also, you know, again, Josh and I get a lot of credit for and beautiful introductions like that. But I think the most important thing we did was really raise the flag and allow all these, you know, other people to come along to help us make that happen. And a lot of it has been our staff. We've been really blessed with just incredible staff, and we have 2 ex-staff members here in the front row, Katie, Laura, and Salman Khan. Yes, come on. And Katie is really, she should have her name up there. She really helped write this book, interview Josh and I to create all this, put it all together in a very short amount of time. So I'm especially grateful to Katie for that. And that's it. Any questions? Great.
So, as is usually the case, we have time for questions from the floor, comments. We'll spend about 15 minutes maximum on that. So let's open the floor, please, to questions for Robert Hammond. Yes. Do we have, by the way, wait for the microphone, and feel free to identify yourself. It's not on.
All right. Hi, I'm Lindsay. I'm an architect here, and I did just go visit the Highline last weekend. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the development above and below the sort of Highline's plane, because I was really intrigued by what you talked about briefly in the lecture about the restaurant, and I know there's another couple of places that there's a beer garden under there somewhere, and the Standard Hotel does fly over the space. Can you talk about that process of encouraging that kind of development?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the issues, we don't own any property. The railroad owned the structure itself and a 30-foot easement. So it was sort of interesting. There were 22 private property owners that owned all the property. And that was really the crux of the problem, is that these property owners wanted to tear it down so they could build up. So we don't have control over what people always call me and say, I can't believe you're letting this ugly building go up, which, one, I don't have any control, and the city doesn't have any control over, you know, as long as it's within zoning. What we do is you can cajole, you know, encourage, and you basically, it self-selects the developers that want to work, want to collaborate, want to hear what we want to do, you know, do, and some don't. And in some ways, a precedent for this was the Promenade Plantée in Paris, which was an elevated railroad that converted into a park, and they own the property underneath it. And it's these beautiful sort of stone arches, and they come up with a great idea. All the businesses will only sell things that they make. So there's like a violin maker that makes the violins, and he sells it there. And it's been a failure. It didn't work. Those businesses, I mean, the Promenade Plantée has been relatively successful, but those businesses have never really thrived and taken off. And so sometimes I think that it's been good. We have all these different uses, from beer gardens to parking to auto body shops. The restaurant that I showed you is the only space the city owns, because it was in a city-owned meat market, and it's where the Whitney is going, and it's still a working meat market right next to it. So that's why we're getting there. Then this summer, what you might be talking about also is the summer we got a developer to give us a parking lot for the summer, and we opened a beer garden under that, and we did a roller skating rink, which was my I was telling someone earlier today that that's all I cared about last year. I wasn't that, I was excited we opened Section 2, but I was more excited we opened this roller skating rink underneath the High Line. But it was just for the summer, so we're always sort of looking for opportunities where we can take advantage of space. But we don't really have a direct control over what happens next to it, and it's really more just driven by how they can make the most money, out of the spot.
You didn't mention anything about the financing and construction funding, who it came from, what the mix was, and how you humbly raised $150 million.
Yeah, I love talking about the money. I don't know why I didn't talk about the money. Because it's a really, obviously, critical part. So the cost is about $150 million. The majority of that is, I think you'll be happy to know, was most people assume, Diller's Confedio, field operations, it's all expensive design. The actual things that you see and enjoy up on the High Line did not cost that much. The whole planting bill was less than $1 million. The planks are just precast. There's 7 different forms that are used to create. They're basically like parking curbs. But where most of the money went in the remediation, the largest single bill for anything we did was we spent $30 million on lead paint remediation. And then where the money came from was we raised, it breaks out a little, almost that the city paid a little under $100 million from the mayor and the city council. We got $20 million from federal monies, mainly highway monies, basically highway pork that is not going to happen anymore. Appropriations bills, earmarks, and then the rest we raised privately. And then we're continuing now for Section 3, we're going to have to raise it almost all privately because the city just can't afford to put more in. No, it's interesting, we really don't. If we could do it again, I think we'd redo the zoning so that actually right now we receive no benefits from the increase in property values. The zoning was so, at the time the High Line was still so unlikely and people were fighting it. The idea that it would create a boom in development was so, the developers were so resistant to it that that zoning would have never gotten passed. So we mostly raise it from philanthropists. And interestingly, the developers, we get some money, mostly operating money. It costs about $3 million to operate the park for programming, art, and just maintenance. We get a lot of that from developers, but the capital money, it doesn't fit into developers' business model. Developers don't have lines on their business plan for give $2 million to park. It just, and it's been really, we get it from developers that have been successful elsewhere. Our biggest contributors are Barry Diller and his wife Diane von Furstenberg, the designer, that both have offices in the neighborhood. Barry Diller has the offices in the Frank Gehry building. They just last week, 2 weeks ago, announced that they were going to give a additional $20 million gift that's going to go to helping us finish Section 3 and to the endowment. That's one of the things that we're focusing on, is raising money for an endowment. So we'll have money. Right now, every year, we have to start from scratch raising $3 million. So that's why.
Are you suggesting that a financing mechanism that would have sort of tied increases in property value to the funding of the High Line would or would not have worked?
I think it would have worked now. It just, if we'd known how it's successful. We also, one of our biggest failures was we tried to do a bid, which is called a business improvement district. There's about 60 of them in New York. So we launched that this effort, and we had the majority of the property owners were supportive. What it is it's a small tax that's added onto your real estate bill, and it was going to be 9 cents a square foot. So if you had 1,000 square feet, it would be $90 a year. So very small, but it would raise us $1 million. That was fought. We lost that battle. The New York Post came out against it. Katie remembers those days. She ran all of our communications then. And a small group of property owners fought that, even though the majority, we had 70% of the property owners that supported it. So that was another way we thought that we could tie running the park to increase in property values.
Now, this stuns me. I mean, at the beginning, I get it. Everybody's sort of breathing in and sort of doesn't want to raise their hands. I mean, this I'm almost flabbergasted about. Thanks. Go ahead.
Hi. What do you learn from your community participation that you have?
Can you speak a little louder, please?
What do you learn from your community participation meetings that you have?
I mean, one of the things that the community said is they wanted to be slow. They didn't want bikes. About half of I ride my bike. I actually don't commute on the High Line. I could, but I bike to work. About half our office bikes to work. One of the things the community says is they didn't want bikes, is they wanted it to be slower. We learn a lot of elderly people have issues with bikes and don't feel safe walking when they're bikes. And there's Hudson River Park right nearby. And they wanted it to be slower and more contemplative. And it really didn't work that well for bikes anyway because it's elevated, it's not that long. We have a bike path right nearby. They wanted the lawn. One of the things we heard after we opened Section 1 was that they wanted a place to sit on the grass. So we added the lawn in Section 2. And they loved the feeling of what was up there. I mean, the biggest design driver, interestingly, was the Joel Sternfeld photo and those photos that he took in all different seasons. So people fell in love with that sort of seasonal change. And that in some ways was one of the biggest design drivers. And people just kept going back, and we want it to be like that, even though you had to rip it all out to be able to do it.
And beyond.
I just feel like there are so many things to be excited about in this project, and was wondering what is the thing that excites you the most about having achieved it.
Yeah, well, I got an email from a friend of mine right after we opened Section 1, and it said, congratulations, you never have to do anything else again in your life. And so I printed that out and put it, because next to my desk. So. But the thing that I always had 3 goals for the Highland. My personal goals were, 1, that it become a well-loved park by New Yorkers. And again, I sort of talked a little bit about that. 2, that it gets better after Josh and I leave, that it's not dependent upon us. I have this obsession with founder syndrome and how sometimes people stay too long places, or that it becomes dependent on them and becomes so driven by their personality when they leave, it struggles or has trouble raising money. So, building an organization that doesn't really need us, and I think we're, sort of at that point. But 3, the thing is that it inspires other people to start these kind of things, and not really. I mean, I love it that there are now a lot of elevated rail line projects moving forward. There's a great one in Chicago, Bloomingdale Trail. There's one in Jersey City. There's one in Philadelphia. Atlanta sort of has one. But to me, the more interesting ones are just people without experience, no money, no plan, no vision, or a vague vision, starting the projects. And that by our example, you don't need to have it all figured out. You don't necessarily need to be an expert to be able to get it done. So that's what I find the most inspiring is talking. One of our volunteers started a group called Open House New York in New York that's now, I think, in its 7th, 8th year, where it opens up spaces that are, so it's not even like it's more of an organization. And there's a group in New York that wants to build an AIDS memorial in an old site next to St. Vincent. There's just all these projects. And it's not like I don't feel like we were inspired by other people. We're just another stop in these people starting, but of stories. Central Park was an inspiration to us. The woman that started Central Park Conservancy was actually from my hometown, San Antonio, and she just lived on the park and realized, wanted to pitch in to make it, to revitalize it. So to me, that's the thing that's most exciting, is that, seeing other people. I met someone on the plane coming up here who worked for us doing crowd control when we first opened. And she said she's been inside. She was on her way to Sierra Leone to try to start a film festival there. And, you know, I think seeing that two guys that don't, as one writer said, neighborhood nobodies, you know, can start something that keeps going.
Did you have your...
Obviously, it's a very exciting project, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of unleashing the beast of revitalization of the area and the great changes that are now happening around it, and if there are any sort of zoning protections for some of the older, kind of more industrial fabrics around it that make it so interesting.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, a lot of people think that I might be really smart, but the true test is that I live in a rental apartment. That I never bought an apartment near the High Line and didn't take advantage of any of this. So that's how I always point that Josh is smarter. Josh bought an apartment near the High Line. So I am a victim of rising rents. But there are some protections. In the rezoning, they kept the mid-blocks manufacturing to preserve the art gallery uses. There's a whole new historic district that was put in northern Chelsea after the High Line rezoning that landmarks industrial buildings. But, I mean, people are getting kicked out. There was an auto body shop right on 26th Street that was evicted by their landlord. And interestingly, like, literally blamed us, said the High Line people want us to leave in an article. We loved it. But, you know, when you increase the property values, you are going to have that change, which is, you know, and sometimes I think we get maybe too much credit and too much blame. I mean, New York is always changing. This was a very undeveloped area of Manhattan that was going to be developed. We didn't, you know, the galleries were there before us. The shishi restaurants and shops, the meatpacking there were before us. I think we're accelerating some of those changes. I mean, maybe naively what I believe is that it's also will always be a reminder of the history of, you know, of the line. And without the High Line, you would have just had yet more development, you know, along there, albeit maybe in a slower timeline.
Well, you didn't really take it as your remit to do planning for the whole area. I mean, you viewed the district, but you were more or less
the only
focused.
reason we got involved in the rezoning was to save the High Line.
Right.
Like, we didn't set out to do. The other thing that's interesting, there's two large low-income housing projects there. So 90% of the kids that live in the neighborhood are on a lunch program. So it's not really a typical gentrification issue where it's really going to be a neighborhood of very poor and very rich. And so a lot of the programs we do are focused on programs in those NYCHA housing.
Okay. Last question.
Have you problems in the High Line project with vandalism or demolition?
Yeah, one of my favorite reasons not to do the High Line was they said it's going to become homophobic because people are going to stand on the High Line and throw bottles at gays and transvestites. Which has not happened. But one of the real serious issues was vandalism on. Our biggest concern was people throwing things down at people below. And we've had no incidents. We've had no crime, no incidents of throwing, or people always also worried that they would commit suicide by jumping over, which would have been like just a bad idea because you wouldn't have died. You know, it's only 2 stories. But we do have occasional vandalism, but it's really, we're so busy, we really have very little. It took, I think it was maybe 9 months before we had our first graffiti, which, you know, is pretty impressive. And most of it's really small. It's pins on the wood slats. So, but that's really because it's so well used that you really just don't have that. And we close it at night. We close all the entrances, so it closes down at night.
Thank you, Robert Hammond.
Thanks. The intro. Thank you.
Terrific. And now it's got this.